I paid for everything for 10 years. Then they called the police to remove me. My father's dying wish made me the provider at 15. For a decade, I poured everything I had into a family that would ultimately try to steal my cars and destroy my sobriety on the worst night of my life. A first-person account 20-minute read. People romanticize last words. In the movies, a dying father grips his son's hand and breathes something profound. Something the son will carry like a lantern through every dark corridor of his life. My father's last words to me were not profound. They were an instruction, delivered in the tone he used for everything, flat, certain, leaving no room for argument. Look after the family. I was 15 years old. He was gone within the week. I want to be clear about who he was, because the story doesn't make sense without it. My father was an abusive man. He was not the kind of father people weep over freely, the kind whose funeral overflows with stories of warmth and sacrifice. Ours was a home shaped by his moods, by the particular silence that fell over rooms when his footsteps came down the hall. I had spent my entire childhood learning to be small, learning to anticipate, learning to survive him. And yet, when he died, I took those 4 words seriously. I don't fully understand why, even now. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the strange, irrational loyalty children carry for parents who never deserved it. Maybe I simply didn't know yet what those words would cost me. Whatever the reason, I made a decision at 15 that would define the next 10 years of my life. I would look after the family. What followed was a decade of financial servitude dressed up as love, and a betrayal so complete that it broke my 2 years of sobriety in a single night. At 15, looking after the family meant small things at first. Running errands. Helping with groceries when the benefits came through. Doing the things around the house that my father had supposedly done, though in truth he had done very little. But I was also 15, newly without a father, and the world was not designed to let a 15-year-old carry much. That changed fast. I grew up faster than most, not by choice but by circumstance. I left school with qualifications, found work, found better work, and then found the kind of work that actually paid. Trades. Labor. The kind of industries where a young man with a strong back and no fear of early mornings can build something real. And with every pay rise, every new contract, every step up, the money I poured into the family home grew. By the time I was 17, I was contributing meaningfully to the household bills. By 19, I was covering most of them. By 21, I was covering all of them. My mother did not work. She was on benefits, and she stayed on benefits for the entirety of this period. My siblings, who cycled in and out of the house depending on their own circumstances, also did not work in any sustained way. There was always a reason: health, opportunity, timing, bad luck. I never stopped to audit those reasons. I just kept paying. The mortgage. The utilities. The food. The council tax. The repairs when something broke, which was often, because a house where nobody works also tends to be a house where nobody maintains things. I paid for all of it, year after year, from the age of 15 to the age of 25. A decade of my working life funneled into a property that was not in my name. I was covering everything: the mortgage, utilities, food, repairs. For 10 years. All from a house that was not, and would never be, in my name. I tried, early on, to address that. The house was in my mother's name, technically an inheritance from my father's side of things, complicated in the way that working-class property always is, informally arranged, poorly documented, emotionally loaded. Every time I raised the idea of having my name put on the deeds, something shifted in the room. My mother would go quiet in a particular way. Someone would bring up my father, what he would have wanted, what the family meant. I would feel the guilt rise up through my chest like floodwater and I would back down. This happened more times than I can count. It was not accidental. Looking back now with the clear eyes that distance gives you, I can see it was a system, not necessarily a conscious conspiracy, but a finely tuned set of responses that had evolved specifically to keep me paying without ever gaining any security. Every time I pushed, the emotional weather changed. Every time I threatened to pull back, someone got sick or a bill arrived or a crisis materialized that only I could resolve. I kept paying. Because what was the alternative? Let the family lose the house. Let my mother end up on the street. I was the one who looked after the family. That was who I was. My father had told me so with his last breath. The $32,000 car is the detail people always react to first when I tell this story, and I understand why. It is a large number. It is a number that takes most people years to save. I bought it for my mother because her car was failing, because she needed transport, and because, as always, there was nobody else who was going to do it. I did not buy it with resentment, not at the time. I bought it because I wanted to help. I want to be honest about that. But the car is also a useful data point because it illustrates something important about the dynamic that had developed in that house. I could buy my mother a brand new vehicle worth $32,000, and the response was not gratitude so much as an updated expectation. The floor had moved. The baseline of what I did, what I was expected to do, what was simply part of the arrangement, it rose every year without ever being explicitly discussed. You cannot negotiate with a baseline. It simply is. The tools were different. The tools were something else. My work required equipment. Good equipment, properly maintained, because in the trades your tools are your livelihood. I kept them carefully. I knew what I had and where it was. But I traveled for work, sometimes for weeks at a time, and the house was a place where people moved freely and things moved with them, never quite returning to where they started. I would come back from a job to find a tool missing. Or present but wrong, used hard, not cleaned, a blade dulled or a battery run flat and not recharged. Sometimes I would find parts stripped from my cars. Not borrowed with a note, not replaced, not mentioned. Just gone, quietly absorbed into whatever repair someone had needed doing on whatever vehicle they were driving that week. I would ask. There would be vagueness. Things had gotten confused. Surely I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. I learned not to make a big deal out of it. That lesson cost me thousands over the years in replaced equipment and vehicles that needed fixing. But the financial cost was almost secondary to what it did to me psychologically, the slow, grinding lesson that my things were not quite my things, that the boundaries I tried to draw around my own property were essentially decorative, that the house I paid for was not, in any meaningful sense, mine. When I was in my early 20s, I built a small home on the property. A self-contained unit, one bedroom, its own bathroom, a kitchen, everything a person needs to live independently. I designed it, sourced the materials, did much of the construction myself, and paid for every penny of it. It sat on the land attached to the family house, compact and clean and entirely mine. This was, I think now, the first real attempt I made to carve out something that was genuinely separate, a space that was mine by construction rather than by negotiation. I didn't have to ask permission to be in it. I didn't have to justify my presence there. It was the only structure in my world that felt unambiguously like it belonged to me. But I was still on the property. Still attached, literally and figuratively, to the house I'd been paying for all those years. And the fundamental dynamic hadn't changed. I was still contributing to the family's expenses, still deflecting every attempt to formalize the financial arrangements, still unable to quite let go of the responsibility I had taken on at 15. Then my partner got pregnant. Something shifted in me when I found out we were having a child. It was not a dramatic epiphany, more like a slow clarification, like a lens coming into focus over the course of days and weeks. I had spent 10 years looking after a family that was not my own family in any chosen sense, a family I had inherited by birth and bound myself to by a promise I made when I was too young to understand what it meant. Now I was about to have a family that I had chosen. A child who would need me in ways I had never needed anyone, because I had never been allowed to need anyone. My priority was going to be my son. That was the decision I made, quietly and completely, before he was even born. I had spent 10 years looking after a family I'd inherited. Now I was going to have a family I had chosen. That changed everything. I made one last attempt to resolve things properly. I offered to buy the property. To formalize what had been, in practice, my financial relationship with that house for a decade. A real transaction, a fair price, legal and clean. I had the means to do it. It would have given my mother security and given me what I had never had, actual ownership of something I had paid for. They came back with a number that no estate agent would have touched. A number pulled, it seemed, not from any market valuation but from some internal calculation of how much I owed, how much I could pay, how much I was worth to squeeze. The number was not a counteroffer. It was a statement. It said, "You will not leave here on your own terms." So my partner and I bought somewhere else. We found a place, went through the process, signed the papers. We started to plan the move. My son was 4 months old. I want to describe what a 4-month-old requires of you, because it matters for what comes next. A 4-month-old is entirely helpless, entirely present, entirely consuming. He does not sleep in long stretches. He cannot be left. He is, in those early months, a small and urgent universe around which everything else orbits. My partner had returned to work during the day because we needed the income, which meant that on weekdays I was at home with our son. Feeding, settling, changing, holding, watching, being with him in the way that new parents are with their children, that total and exhausting way. We had already begun the move. Things were packed. Boxes sat against walls. The logistics were in motion. The house we were leaving, the property I had paid for, built in, maintained, funded for a decade, was in its final weeks of holding me. The family arrived during the day. I was home with the baby. I don't know exactly what they expected to find or what they expected to happen, but what happened was a confrontation. Raised voices. Accusations I won't dignify by repeating in detail. The particular cruelty of people who feel they are losing leverage and are reaching for whatever emotional weapons are closest to hand. They called me a terrible father. A 4-month-old baby in the house, a partner out working to fund our new life, boxes packed against every wall. And they called me a terrible father. That evening, my sister called the police. She told them I needed to be trespassed from the property. The property I had paid for since I was 15 years old. The property where I had built, with my own hands and my own money, a self-contained home. The property that had consumed tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars of my earnings over a decade. She called the police and told them I didn't belong there. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves to be felt rather than just processed. This was not a stranger's property. This was not even a technicality, a name on a deed that didn't include mine. This was a home I had kept alive. My mother's car, sitting in that driveway, I had bought. The roof over their heads, I had maintained. The bills that had kept the lights on and the gas running and the water flowing for a decade, I had paid them. And now someone was asking the police to remove me from it as though I were an intruder. She called the police and asked them to trespass me from the property I had paid for since I was 15. I stood there, holding my 4-month-old son, and tried to understand what was happening. The police arrived and assessed the situation. They did not trespass me. Whatever my sister had told them, the reality of things, my presence there, the ongoing move, the sheer illogic of the request, meant they left without removing me. The immediate threat passed. But then came the next escalation. My sister threatened to take my cars. Not borrow. Not move them out of the way. Take them. Vehicles I owned, maintained, relied upon for work. This was not a misunderstanding or a heat-of-the-moment slip. It was a deliberate threat, a declaration that if she could not remove me from the property through the police, she would find another way to hurt me through my possessions. The same possessions that had been quietly cannibalized for years. Parts stripped, tools borrowed and never returned, now faced a direct threat. I called some friends. I don't know what I said to them, exactly. I was not in a state where words were coming out cleanly. I know I was holding my son at some point during those phone calls, or he was nearby, and the contrast between his complete unawareness of what was happening and my own barely contained devastation was something I will not forget. They came. That night, a group of people who had no obligation to be there, who had their own lives, their own evenings, their own things to attend to, showed up and helped me move. Not slowly, not in the careful and organized way a move is supposed to happen, but urgently, practically, in the way that people move when the situation has become something other than normal. They moved the cars first, getting them off the property and somewhere safe. Then they helped with the rest of our things. The boxes, the furniture, the accumulated material evidence of a life that had been, despite everything, being carefully built in the margins of all this obligation. My son was there through all of it, in the way that babies are there, present, oblivious, occasionally demanding attention with the cheerful tyranny of the very young. It took hours. By the end, we were out. The move that had been in progress for weeks was suddenly, violently complete. We were in our new place. The place we had chosen, the place we had bought, the place where nobody could call the police on me for being present in my own home. I should have felt relief. I did not feel relief. I felt the kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the physical, the total depletion that comes not from labor but from grief, from betrayal, from the collapse of something you had, despite all evidence, continued to believe in. I had believed, somewhere deep and irrational, that the family I had spent 10 years looking after would not do this. That there was a line they wouldn't cross. That the relationship, however dysfunctional, contained some kernel of genuine care that would, when it mattered, be enough. That night, I broke my 2 years of sobriety. I want to be careful here, because this part of the story matters enormously and I don't want to be careless with it. 2 years of sobriety is not a small thing. It is built day by day, decision by decision, through moments of difficulty that accumulate into something that begins to feel solid, structural, like a foundation you can build on. You learn, in those 2 years, that the craving passes. You learn that the feeling you are trying to drink or use away will be there on the other side too, and that you will have to face it anyway, and that facing it sober is at least facing it clearly. I knew all of this. I had been taught all of this, had practiced all of this, had believed all of this. And then the night came when my family called the police on me while I held my infant son, when my sister threatened to steal my cars, when everything I had given for 10 years was shown to have counted for exactly nothing in the eyes of the people I had given it to. And the thing I knew, the solid, practiced, hard-won knowledge, was not enough. I am not writing this to excuse what I did. I am writing it to be honest about what that night was, because I think the sobriety detail is often the one that gets skipped over when people tell stories like this, and I think it is actually one of the most important parts. The breaking of sobriety is not just a personal failing that exists separately from the events that preceded it. It is the final evidence of what the events cost. It is the measure of the damage. 2 years. Gone. Because the people I had looked after since I was 15 years old could not, when it came to it, extend to me the most basic human consideration, the recognition that I was a person with a child and a life and a new home, and that perhaps it was time to let me go. 2 years of sobriety. Gone. It is the measure, more than any dollar amount, of what that night actually cost. People sometimes want to know the exact figure. How much did I pay, in total, over those 10 years? I don't have an exact number, partly because I never kept meticulous records. I was a teenager when it started, not a forensic accountant, and partly because some of the costs are difficult to quantify. The tools that disappeared. The car parts stripped without permission. The opportunity costs of the years I spent paying other people's mortgages instead of building equity in something I owned. But indirect, traceable money, tens of thousands, certainly. Probably over 100,000 if you count the car, the bills across the full decade, the building of the small home on the property, and the various crises I funded along the way. I was, at various points, keeping several adults afloat, adults who had made choices about work and benefits and responsibility that meant they did not have to face the consequences of those choices, because I was there to absorb them. The small home I built on the property is worth noting separately. I designed it. I built it. I paid for every material in it. It sits on land that is not in my name. I have no legal claim to it. It exists, presumably still, as a structure I created with my own hands and my own money, benefiting people who, at the first opportunity, tried to have me removed from the premises by the police. I don't include these figures to prompt sympathy, exactly. I include them because I think the scale matters for understanding what I am actually describing. This is not a story about a family disagreement or a difficult relationship or the ordinary friction that comes from living in close quarters with people whose lives are entangled with yours. This is a story about a systematic extraction that lasted 10 years and was maintained through guilt, manipulation, and the particular leverage that last words carry when the person who said them was your father. There is a version of this story where I blame myself entirely. Where I ask, why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you stop paying when it was clear the arrangement was never going to be formalized? Why did you build a home on someone else's land? Why did you let a dying man's words govern a decade of your adult life? I have asked myself these questions. They are not without merit. I made choices that, in retrospect, were not wise. I stayed longer than I should have. I gave more than I should have. I let guilt and obligation function as substitutes for actual family relationships, as though the money I paid could somehow compensate for the love that was not there. But I also understand now, in a way I couldn't at 15 or 20 or even 24, that the system I was in was designed to keep me in it. The guilt tripping when I raised the property question. The crises that materialized whenever I showed signs of pulling back. The family rhetoric deployed to reframe my financial contributions as expressions of love rather than what they actually were, the payments of someone who had been given a job they never asked for by a man who had no right to assign it. My father was abusive. I have said that, and I mean it, and I want to sit with what it means that his last words to me were enough to shape a decade of my life. Abuse does not end with the abuser. It continues in the patterns it creates, the roles it assigns, the sense of obligation it instills in children who never learned they were allowed to have boundaries. I was not, at 15, capable of understanding that, look after the family, was not a sacred duty. I was a child who had spent his entire life learning that his father's word was absolute, and so his father's last word was absolute too. It took me until I was 25, with a 4-month-old son and a group of friends moving my cars in the dark, to finally, completely, understand that I was allowed to stop. He is the reason I can tell this story with something other than pure bitterness. Not because he resolves it, he doesn't, he can't, he is a baby and this is not his burden, but because of what he made clear to me before any of this happened. When I found out we were going to have a child, I felt something clarify. The question I had been unable to answer for 10 years, whose needs come first? Suddenly had an answer that was so obvious it almost made me laugh. His. My son's. The child who was coming into the world and who would need, above everything, a father who was present and functional and not depleted by a decade of emotional labor and financial extraction. I want to be the kind of father who does not leave his child a deathbed instruction to carry. I want to be the kind of father who builds things with my son instead of building things for people who do not value them. I want to be the kind of father who teaches his child that love is not proved by sacrifice alone, that you can love people and still maintain the boundaries that keep you whole. These are not complicated ideas. Most people arrive at them naturally, through functional families and healthy relationships. I arrived at them through a decade of their opposite, at significant personal cost, in a house I paid for and was eventually threatened out of. But I arrived at them. That matters. My son is past those early months now. He is growing in the way that children grow, fast, constantly surprising, full of a personality that is already clearly his own. We are in our home, the one we bought together, the one where the deeds have my name on them. I know what is mine there. Nothing will be stripped from my cars. No tools will disappear. My relationship with my family is what it is. I will not pretend to a neat resolution because there isn't one. The people who called the police on me that night, who threatened my cars, who called me a terrible father while my infant son was in the room, they are still my family in the biological sense, and probably always will be. What they are not is my obligation anymore. That word, obligation, is the one I have had to learn to separate from the word love. They can coexist, but they are not the same thing, and for most of my life I treated them as synonymous. I confused paying for love and confused stopping payment with abandonment. I confused my father's instruction with a genuine ethical duty. I confused looking after people with allowing them to look through me entirely, as though I were a resource rather than a person. I am building my sobriety again. Day by day, the way you do, without looking too far ahead. I am clear about what broke it and why, and I carry that clarity not as shame but as information about what I am capable of enduring, and about where my actual limits are, and about the importance of not waiting until the limits are exceeded to act. I confused paying for love. I confused stopping payment with abandonment. I am done with that confusion now. I have been asked, since I started talking about this publicly, whether I regret it. Whether I wish I had never taken on the responsibility, never paid the bills, never built the house on the property, never bought the car. It is a complicated question. I regret the naivety. I regret the years I spent hoping things would formalize into something fair, the mental energy I poured into a situation that was never going to resolve in my favor, the sobriety I lost on a night that never should have happened if the people around me had been capable of the most basic decency. But I don't regret the 15-year-old boy who took those 4 words seriously and tried to do the right thing with them. He was doing the best he could with what he had, which was very little. He was keeping a promise to a man who didn't deserve promises, in a family that didn't deserve the sacrifices he was making, because he had been taught that this was what you did. He did not yet know he was allowed to want things for himself. I know now. My son will know it from the beginning. That is the only inheritance I have to give that actually matters, and I intend to give it cleanly.